Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Major Aaron Corman. I'm a member of Staff Group 13 Alpha and this year's Class Vice President. Each year, the Command and General Staff College Foundation provides the Colin L. Powell Lecture Series to the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College as a gift that enhances the professional development of CGSC students and faculty through the discussion of national security issues by a prominent leader. The Colin L. Powell Lecturer for the academic year 2025 is General Vincent K. Brooks, U.S. Army, retired. General Brooks served in the U.S. Army for over 42 years, from his entry into the United States Military Academy at West Point until his retirement from active duty in 2019 as a 4-star general. General Brooks spent his final 17 years of service in the general officer ranks, and in nearly all of those years in command of large, complex military organizations in challenging situations. His military and service includes tours of duty in Europe, the Middle East and Central Asia, the Western Hemisphere, the Indo-Pacific region, and the American homeland. In his post-military career, General Brooks is a board director for 3 public companies, Diamondback Energy, Verisk Analytics, and Jacobs, 1 nonprofit organization, the Gary Sinise Foundation, and is former board chair and president of the Korea Defense Veterans Association. He is a consultant principal with the prominent national security consulting firm, West Exec Advisors. He is also a member of the Defense Advisory Committee on Diversity and Inclusion, and also holds an endowed chair at West Point as the Class of 1951 Chair for the Study of Leadership. General Brooks is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and is also a fellow at 3 prestigious intellectual centers: Belfer Center at the Harvard Kennedy School, Clements Center for National Security at the University of Texas, and Strauss Center for International Security and Law at the University of Texas. He holds a Bachelor of Science from the United States Military Academy at West Point, a Master of Military Art and Science from the U.S. Army School of Advanced Military Studies, an Honorary Doctorate of Laws from New England School of Law, an Honorary Doctor of Humanities from New England Law, Boston. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome General Brooks.
Thanks a lot. All right. Are we hot? Can everyone hear me okay? Good morning. Welcome to Fort Leavenworth. I've been here before, and this may be your first time, maybe not, but it's a delight to be back here at Fort Leavenworth. I have a lot of memories about my experiences here, some as a student, but they go much further back than that. I remember being here as a child. I went to 3rd grade here, and honestly, and you'll hear this, it's the best year of your life, but for me as a kid, throughout my entire journey as a military child, absolutely the best experience I ever had, and the one that's still most memorable to me, is Fort Leavenworth. And so I'll tell you up front, try to make it count for your families. They're going to have a good time whether you do or not, okay? Let me just say first to the faculty, to the CGSC Foundation, thanks for inviting me to come and deliver the Colin Powell Lecture. It's an honor to be able to be with you to do that. And to the students, congratulations. So you have achieved a lot in your career already to bring you to this point. And now you have a chance to concentrate for the next 10 months on your business as professional warfighters to prepare you for what's going to come in the years ahead. So this is a critical point in your career. This is not a check-the-block experience. Now, you can make it one, but that's really not what it is, and I'll talk a little bit about what it is you're here for in a few moments. Let me say also to the international students who are here, we're glad you're here. Your country thinks a lot about you. That's why you're here. That's why you've been chosen. I can tell you from my CGSC class, there are many who went on to prominence in their own country. And of course, there's a Hall of Fame here, and I hope to see all of you one day having your pictures added to the CGSOC Hall of Fame for those that went on to lead their army or lead their military forces after graduating from this place. And you also, international students, you represent the interests of the United States of America. We need allies, we need partners around the world to keep the world a better and safer place for everyone. And we do that with you. And it's an honor to have you here as well. So we want to make sure we talk to you. I know we have 5 whole of government teammates in here as well. It's a small number, but a powerful group. Your challenge is to make sure that these people in uniform speak to you in a language that you understand, which is the language of the interagency. And you uniform students, I want you to think differently about how you communicate. Practice it while you're here. Because as you advance through your career, you will find yourself in audiences that are less and less uniformed military. And certainly at the high-level staffs, which you will ultimately arrive at, you've got to communicate in a very different language. And your whole of government teammates can help you do that right now because they live it all the time. So I want you to practice all that while you're here. I've got several things I want to talk to you about today. And then we're going to have some time to interact. I do remember when I was on the other side of the stage, sitting in the audience, and there's something I call a circle of life. Let's go ahead and advance to the first slide, please. The circle of life. And that is this. I remember as a CGSC student sitting in not this auditorium, but in the old academic building, in the big auditorium, and we'd have generals, senior leaders come through and get on the stage and talk to us. Most of us were a little bit cynical already, and as the year went on, we got more and more cynical. Many of the speakers we had that year were the division commanders from Operation Desert Shield, Desert Storm, because that's where I was here at Leavenworth when that was happening, which is part of why we were all cynical, because we just missed a war and we were in class. We didn't go to Saudi, but we watched it on TV. And we would get frustrated with these generals because we were convinced that they were clueless. So I know what you might be thinking. The circle of life, though, is that you sitting in the audience now have certain things that you're frustrated about, certain things you would like to see your service do better, our nation do better. And you have a yearning inside of you to make it better. And yet these generals are up here, they're in the way. Interestingly, a few years later, Chief of Staff of the Army, General Eric Shinseki, who had been one of my mentors since I was a cadet, so I knew him when he was a major, two-time Vietnam veteran, Purple Heart, a great history, now Chief of Staff of the Army. And he had a conversation with new Brigadier Generals right here at Fort Leavenworth, because this is where we met. And he told me about his experience being a major and having these generals standing up there. All these majors are recent combat returnees. They've got these generals talking to them about things, and just the generals didn't have a clue about what they were really experiencing. And all those majors in the audience said, if we ever get the chance, we'll make it right. And now he's Chief of Staff of the Army. And the majors at Leavenworth thought he was clueless too. Well, same thing applies to me. So I'm standing up here, you probably think I'm clueless. And there are certain things that I know that you don't know. And there are things that you experience that I didn't experience. And we have the opportunity to exchange with one another right now. And one day you will have the chance to be a clueless general standing on the stage. But what you want to do is take that fire that's inside of you that causes you to want to make it better and never let it go. Because when you get the chance to make it better, some things will have changed behind you, but there will still be the same frustrations you've been knocking against your whole career. And you have a chance to make at least that better. And then the majors that you're talking to will make the rest better. That's the circle of life. Agitated, frustrated, experienced captains and majors sitting in Leavenworth who want their chance to make it better. And they'll get that chance. But only if you pay attention this year. All right, so that's the circle of life. Let me talk about what it is you're being prepared for. I want to dispel any illusions that you're being qualified to go be a Battalion S3 or Battalion XO. That's not what this place is about. You are being prepared for high-level staff. Okay? And I'll say that as division to joint staff. That's space. Multiple echelons of staff. You're also being prepared for command so that you can think through the problems that you'll have to decide and understand and direct as a commander. But most of your career will be spent as a staff officer. And how you become an effective staff officer at high-level staffs, division and higher, will be dependent upon how well you learn and apply the curriculum that will be presented to you here at Fort Leavenworth. That's your preparation. This is preparing you for the next long run. You're at one rung below the top rung of the military education model, which is the Senior Service College. That's the last one after this. And it's a long run to go from being a new major to being a post-war college lieutenant colonel or colonel. A long run. You must be prepared for what happens in between, and this is the place to prepare you. So take it seriously. Now, we used to have an adage, the faculty hates to hear me say this, but it's only a lot if you read it. The material is worth reading, so I want you to read it, and it is a lot, and it's going to consume your time, but that's why you're here. You are not disrupted by other activities. You are fundamentally here as a student to learn, and I really want you to do that. Not just from the books, not just from the academic readings and the exercises, but especially from each other. The greatest learning will happen in your discourses with one another in staff group. Anybody in 10C here, 10 Charlie? Oh, y'all are weak. Come on now. My class is old. We'd make more noise than you. No, I was in 10C as well, so it's good to see 10C, and I will be calling on you when we get to question and answers. All right. Let me talk about the world that awaits you. And I want to just create a little bit of context for you. Remember, you're being prepared for staff and command, division and higher, not brigade and below. And you have to understand the world because the commands within which you're going to operate will be representing your country, representing the United States of America to others and being connected to policy objectives. All right, that's what those high commands do. They become an instrument to be used by national leaders to try to create a different circumstance, create a different set of relationships, to deter, to compel, to exact cost. And these types of terms are not the same as the tactical terms that you'll study this year. So understanding the world a little bit better will help you understand your role a little bit better. Let's go to the next one, please. Now, this is my learned experience and conception about competition, crisis, and conflict. Sometimes we see those listed out on a continuum. At one end, you have competition, and somewhere there's a crisis point that's between competition and conflict, and then the opposite extreme is conflict, including global war at the far end. I believe the reality is not that, okay? And whether you portray it on a continuum or not is not the important point, but rather to recognize scale and application. And I want you to take this thought in, and hopefully this is something you talk about in your classes. Competition is the global activity. Competition is the global activity. It's ongoing, continuously. It is done through various instruments. And each nation that engages in competition on the global stage brings its own instruments to bear. They're not all the same. Some have heard about dime or dime fill or midlife as U.S. elements or instruments of national power. You'll hear about that. But every country is different. So while the U.S., for example, may have a strong element of military power, given that it has global force laydowns, combatant commands, and the ability to project anywhere in the world. Not every country can say that or do that, but that is a power that the United States has. That's not necessarily the same power that other countries have as they compete on the global scale. They compete for economy, they compete for influence, they compete for hegemony, the ability to call the shots. They compete for survival. There are various motives for competition. It is the global activity. And it is the one that you will spend most of your time engaged in. You're not going to spend most of your career engaged in a war. But you will spend your time engaged in competition. So I want you to think about competition as the big one, the base of all things. Crisis, in my experience, is a local activity. Something flares up. A hot-dogging Chinese pilot hits a U.S. Navy reconnaissance aircraft, knocks the nose off of it while in flight. An emergency landing is required. The landing happens in Hainan, China, in Chinese airspace, Chinese territory. We don't have a dialogue with them. We can't get our aircraft back. We don't know what the status of the crew is. China begins to reverse engineer it. It's now escalating quickly. That's a crisis. But it's all localized at Hainan. And it has reverberations beyond that in capitals and in societies. But the activity of crisis itself is a local problem. Conflict. This is one we often think about as we operate against near peers around the world. We focus on major combat operations against a near peer on a global scale. Folks, that's a failure. If we get to the point where we have a global conflict, we failed. So even when I was a theater commander, theater army commander, and I did that 2 different times in the Middle East region, Middle East, Central Asia, as well as in the Indo-Pacific region, we had a clear understanding as senior commanders, and often had this said when we were with one another: if we have to execute the war plan, then we've already failed. Because our efforts to deter, our efforts to communicate, our efforts to compel, dissuade, they will have failed if you find yourself moving from competition through crisis that may trigger a larger escalation and into full-scale war, nation against nation. And to have that burn out to a global scale is a very unusual occurrence in humankind. Now, I'm not saying don't study it. You absolutely have to study how do you fight in that kind of circumstance. But I want you to think of conflict as more a regional matter than a global matter. And it may affect several countries in a given region. It might be in Southeast Asia, or it might be in the Middle East, or it might be in Central or South America. God forbid it would be in the United States. We don't want to play home games. We only want to play away games. But that away game is home for somebody else. And how do you keep that at a regional level and then down to a local level if you can, to move from conflict back toward crisis, or beyond crisis back into competition? That's what your effort should be. Always driving back to competition. And competition doesn't mean necessarily violence. The use of violence, which you're all going to be trained to do, already are trained to do. It's how you apply the military instrument to create other geopolitical and national outcomes. Okay? Push it that way. Push it back toward competition. That's your role as staff officers, is to figure out what would it take to move us from this to that. And at the same time, if we find we're having to go toward conflict, what do we need to be able to do? How do we get there? How do we sustain ourselves when we're there? What happens when we lose things? How do we get people out if they're injured or wounded? That whole structure of conducting warfighting, you'll spend some time with this year. But I want you to keep that in mind. It's aberrant. So you won't have conflict unless we fail. And then success depends on your ability to push it back in the other direction. Now I want you to think about the world also. I'm going to put you through a couple warm-ups here real quick, just to make you think differently about the world. As an American, I grew up in a non-digital era, okay? As I said, I was a third grader here in 1966, so it's a few days ago. We had things called atlases, and so you'd turn the page to see the world. And the projections that were shown in that atlas, I have since discovered, having traveled most of the world now, those atlases were wrong. So, for example, you commonly would see this projection. It would have Canada, the United States, Mexico, and maybe you'd see a little bit of South America, Central and South America. And then you could see the edge of Asia on one side of the same page, and you could see Africa and Europe on the other side of the page. It's not like that. It's not like that. You're going to fly for hours and hours and hours to get to the next piece of land if you leave the west coast of the United States and head into the Pacific. 8 hours to get to Guam in the modern era. 8 more hours to get to Singapore. It's not like the map says. If you had a different appreciation for the way the world really looks, you might think differently about what happens in the world and what it takes to get out into that world and to maintain relationships here. So let's advance to the next one here. One slide forward. That's it. Okay? What are we looking at? How many say we're looking at Africa? South America? Middle East? The Atlantic? The Pacific? All right, so you think we're looking at the Pacific? Yes, we are. And we see Asia at the bottom of the screen. That's not the way you have routinely looked at this. Okay? What you can see very, very clearly right through the center is a belt where light blue turns to dark blue. And that's where the quote-unquote first island chain is. As you begin looking at it at the far left, you're in Russia. And you follow the archipelagos down through Japan, and then right in the center where there's this dipping point where dark blue dips down into light blue, that is Taiwan. And then it proceeds on into the Philippines, down into Brunei, down into Malaysia, Indonesia. This is not the way you were raised looking at the map, unless perhaps you live in Asia. This projection, where Japan is on a horizontal scale with nothing above it and the Asian landmass in front of it, is how the Minister of Defense of Japan portrays Japan when I had my first meeting with him. Went into his office, it's right behind his head. That's how he sees it. Sometimes you'll see it the opposite way, where the weight of the world is on top of Japan. That's just an example about how Japan sees it. Do we have any officers from Japan in here? Okay. That's what I saw in their office. And since then, I have projected the world this way whenever I talk to an audience like this, because it causes you to begin to think differently. If you're South Korea, you see that appendage that sticks out, almost like the uvula in your throat. It appends, sticks out. That's the peninsula that's often referred to, and it's north and south that you see there. It's the Asian landmass, extended out into what the Japanese call the Sea of Japan, what the Chinese would call the Yellow Sea, what the South Koreans call the East Sea and the West Sea. And that's important to them, that it's described as East Sea and West Sea, not Sea of Japan or Yellow Sea. My point here, and we can advance one slide that has the key on it, excuse me. For those of you who got it right, you can give yourself a couple points. Put them in your pockets. You might need them later in the academic year. For those of you who didn't get it right, keep looking. This helps you to see it. There's also this band that pushes up toward the top of the global projection here. I would say to the north, but it's actually to the south. That's the second island chain that you see very clearly. It becomes very pronounced when you look at it this way. The landmass is critically important. So is the access to the sea. And how one describes the interests of the players in this region will be different than how you think about it, you Americans who are in the room. I want you to think about it as those who live in the region might see it and feel it. The ever-present influence of China, because it is. Most of that territory you see is China. Most of it. About the rest of it is Russia, off to the left side. But the center of it and down is China. They're huge. They don't have access to the sea. And that may concern them as they want to engage in competition globally in the economic sphere. How can they secure their commerce? How do they create relationships that let them operate on a global scale? And is this light blue part a stricture around them that constrains their ability to fulfill their destiny? Is it containment? Well, in their perspective, yeah, and you can see why if you look at it this way. Let's go to the next slide. What are we looking at? Greenland? The Arctic? Somebody call out a country you see. India. India. All right, so as we're looking at this projection, this is the Indian Ocean. It's huge. The Indian Ocean connects to the Pacific Ocean only through the ends of Indonesia, which you see in the upper left corner. Indonesia, by the way, runs from the upper left corner down to almost the landmass. It is huge. It's not like anything I saw. Any officers from Indonesia here? All right, good to see you. When you think about access to the Indian Ocean from the Pacific or from the light blue areas of the last projection, you have three places through which you can get there with maritime commerce. Has anyone heard of the Strait of Malacca? Okay, you've heard that one. That's right there at Singapore, just south of Malaysia, just north of Indonesia. It's a small space, and you can see that on the map here. So there's a long peninsula that reaches up on the left side, and then it stops, and there's a gap, and then there's a long piece of land that comes from the upper left to the lower right. That's where Malaysia, Singapore, which is an island. Any officers from Singapore in here? And Indonesia. Do we have anyone from Malaysia, by the way? Okay. Is there one? Excellent. Okay, I see you. Thank you very much. Malacca is one. Sunda. I'm with you, Indonesia. Lombok. I've never heard of these things. Now, if you're a maritime officer, you've heard of these things. And you may have passed through them or approached them. And you know how narrowly constricted these three entry points are, these three strategic choke points are. How does China gain access to the Indian Ocean? Through Malacca, Sunda, or Lombok, if by sea, or potentially over land. So you can look at this chart and see, in this case, the light blue area that has this, you'll see a long light blue strip that goes from the lower left to the upper right. Those are the South Pacific Islands. Those are the islands in the South Indian Ocean. And the light blue area where dark blue goes to light as you go to the left, as you look to the left, that's the Andaman Sea. Andaman Sea touches Malaysia, touches Thailand, touches Burma, Myanmar. When it goes further up, it hits Bhutan. It's mountainous. The China-Burma-India theater of World War II was focused in that area, but China is building a highway, superhighway, that goes overland from inside of China out to the Andaman Sea. And there are deep water ports being built there. Some of them are oil terminals, so they can receive Middle East oil, South American oil, instead of through Malacca, Sundar Lumbak, where it currently flows. They can receive it in the Andaman Sea and have it piped overland to meet their needs. Now, why would they do that? Because they might feel like they're being constrained by the presence of U.S. and its allies and partner countries who are on the Pacific side. Their ability to operate in the Indian Ocean requires them to deal with India. Do we have anyone from India? All right, there's one over here. Anyone else? Okay. Make sure you have a conversation with your colleague from India. Over land, there is a high-altitude border. It's referred to as the line of actual control, and it is contested between China and India, and there have been numerous firefights that have happened there. It can happen at any time. It's a fight-tonight location at high altitude in the Himalayas. That's hard duty, very hard duty. So the access to the Indian Ocean is possibly overland across that line of actual control into India. But it can also be in a maritime space. So places like Sri Lanka, Madagascar, Somalia, and now, of course, this base in the Andaman Sea in Burma, Myanmar, that can create a line that goes right across the center of this map. And it creates a line of influence at sea. Getting there for China is a challenge. They might be contested by the allies of the United States and its naval forces trying to get through those three strategic choke points into the Indian Ocean and then conducting operations there. Can't do that if the Pacific Fleet is still in the way. So in my opinion, this is more important than Taiwan. Not from an internal political matter. Certainly Taiwan is most important internally and politically inside of China. Strategically, when it comes to influencing the world, the Indian Ocean and India are the most important places. But they have to get past Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Malaysia, Philippines, Australia, Brunei, Singapore, in order to get to it. That's a hard slog because they're all friends of the United States. So when you think about what you're going to be doing out there in the world, your relationships, the things you do with people who are in this CGSC class, make it possible for that to be a constrained problem for China, a very complex problem. They may choose to try to advance through the Pacific Ocean, but the commerce is in here. And oh, by the way, between the last projection and this projection, 2/3 of the world population lives. It's a really important strategic location. All right, enough of that. Let's go to the next one that shows the key, the answer key. I made reference to several of these: Sri Lanka, Madagascar, Somalia. You'll see those across there. China has built bases in all of them. It's amazing. Why would they do that? So you hear the term setting the theater. They are setting this theater for influence at the very least, and ideally not crisis or conflict. But the potential for crisis in any one of these locales is very high. Okay, let's go on to the next one. So that's a warm-up. I want to get your creative juices flowing. Let me just talk a little bit about what's coming next in your life. And then we'll transition into our interaction. And when we interact, I'm coming down there with you. All right, I'm coming off of this stage. All right, first, what do you do at a general staff? All right, this is the Command and General Staff Officers course, the Command and General Staff College. General staff is in the middle of all that. And that means that you're in the staff of a general officer in command. That's what that means. And those are the levels you can expect to be prepared for. But what do you do there? Your key role is to turn ideas into action. That's what staff officers do at these levels. So the generals will have some ideas. Now, some of you may hear the term a goby. Anyone ever heard that term, a goby? A general officer bad idea? So, every now and then generals come up with good ideas, and sometimes they come up with bad ideas. The idea may have a good origin to it, but how you translate it into action can be much more complex, much more challenging. And they leave that to their staff to do the magic of converting that idea. We need to go here, here's why, here's when, here are the purposes, here are the assets and resources that we know we can have. Make it happen. Major, Lieutenant Colonel, Colonel. The staff converts the idea into actions, and I would say also orders. So orders cause groups of individuals to move in harmony toward a common purpose. The actions are the defined things that will be done by those entities, those units. The ideas are the reasons why, but you must connect all of those, and the staff officer does that at the general staff level. And they're usually complex problems. They're wicked problems, things that defy easy solution. I would encourage you to think about decision point tactics versus focusing on courses of action. Now, I want to be careful here because you're going to be steeped in the doctrine of courses of action and course of action development. You've already been exposed to the military decision-making processes up to this point in time, and they are important. But they are particularly relevant below division level. As you go above that, particularly as you're interfacing with other parts of government, it's more about having options and knowing when that option comes into effect, which means you have decision points. So it may choose to go left or right, but once we have gone left instead of right, there are alternatives that still remain that I can get to if the circumstances are not what I expected. And I can move then to what would have been the alternatives on the right. Or I can move to a different alternative altogether. These are decision points. And your general staff officers or general staff leaders are going to be thinking about that, about decision points and flexibility to perpetuate options more so than they are, sir, I recommend course of action number 2. Course of action number 2 is the obvious reason you would have to be stupid not to pick it because I'm your staff officer and I know what I'm talking about. And that can happen where you narrow down the decision space for the principal making the decision to eliminate as much ambiguity as you can to come up with a solid plan of action, which you must do. But that must be recognized as limited in its scope. Look for the next key decision point where you create a new set of options. Think about that way. That creates the sequentiality of what military operations really require. And that's slightly different than what you've been exposed to up to this point. Next thing. When you go back to a brigade, which you're probably going to do very quickly, you might be in a division level or corps level staff, but you'll ultimately return back into a brigade. You're going to have the feeling of Rip Van Winkle. And so that's an American folklore tale about a guy who falls asleep under a tree and then wakes back up, and time has advanced way beyond what he thought was the period of that sleep. That's what a major is. So while you're here, some of you have recently left units, time will move on. And you're going to arrive back inside of a brigade 2 or 3 years from now. And first, you're going to be really old. Okay? You are an old person when you get back to a unit. You don't think it, but you are. And you'll see that when you look in the faces of those youngsters in there who are in the place that you used to be before you came here. Rip Van Winkle. Now, you have a lot to offer when you get back, but you first have to come to grips with the fact that you're a lot older, a lot more senior than they are, and that you look different to them than you think you look to them. So try to imagine what majors look like to you. And you know they work hard. They do. Some say, I don't want to be a major. Life's terrible as a major. You don't ever get to sleep. Well, that's true. Because you're so busy turning ideas into action and then causing actions and orders to flow so that captains and lieutenants and sergeants can do something relative to your purpose. And you're constantly working that. It's always something. But your chance to develop those captains, those lieutenants, those senior non-commissioned officers, you have power that is immense that you don't even realize. And I want you to be prepared for that and then use it when you get down there. One of the things that I want you to prepare for, this is a Brooks term, so do what you want with it, is overcoming a dynamic that we all go through. Professional puberty. Maybe going, what is this general talking about? Well, you know what traditional biological puberty is. You've all been through that. Everyone in this room has been through it. Some of you might be still grappling with it, but you've all been through it. And if you went through it without anyone sharing with you, hey, it's okay what just happened to you last night. That embarrassing moment that occurred, that's all right. We know what it is. We've all been through it too because we're grown up. You know, someone has to put it into context for you or you may misunderstand it. There is a professional stage of puberty also that I've learned this from my own experience and certainly as I've tried to mentor and develop officers more junior to me. And it's the point where you are right now, where you have been a captain inside of a unit. You may have had the privilege of commanding. You might have fulfilled all of your objectives. Your active duty service obligations have been fulfilled. And now you're trying to decide, should I stick with this? Should I continue to subject my family to this? Maybe you're frustrated that you didn't get to advance as rapidly as you should have because you're a superstar. Or maybe you're satisfied with the fact that you didn't have to work as hard to get paid the same thing as a superstar did. Or maybe you're a little bit tired because you've been running for a long time. Maybe you're contemplating, I want to go back and get more education. I want to make more money. I've got opportunities out there. If I don't leave now, I can't establish myself in this new career field. Maybe you have ideas as an entrepreneur. You know, your generation is highly entrepreneurial. And you may have in your mind, I'd like to run this company that I'm going to create. And I'm going to make a lot of money doing it. I'm going to make something that changes the world. And there are people like you who are doing that right now. And so you will go through this point. What I want you to do is contemplate, and you've already been through this and you might still be in it as you're having these discussions with yourself and with your families this year. And that's okay. I want you to know it's okay. This is just like the thing that happened that night. It may have caused you to feel discomfort in the morning, but the reality is it's normal. It's normal for you to wonder whether you should or should not continue. Now, all of you have accepted the Commanding General Staff College, so you're one step beyond it, but not completely out of it. What I want you to do first is think about answering two questions for yourself. What do I really want? Now, often we'll hear people ask that question. My colleagues that got out at 5 years, 7 years, 10 years, they ask that question, what do I really want? And they will find something that's out there. But I want you to ask a second question, and that is, where might I find it? And that what you really want should not be a specific thing. I want to have this job, I want to work in that company. That's too specific. What do you want in life? Do you want to have structure, or do you want to be unstructured? Do you want to be in an environment where people trust one another from the outset, or do you want to be in an environment where you have to earn trust? Do you want to be part of a collective, or do you want to be an individual? These are the kinds of things you want to ask yourself. What do I really want? Where might I find it? And then as you examine the horizon for what the options are out there, don't lose sight of the one that you already have. Okay? Some of you will decide to stay for a full 20-year, 30-year, 40-year career. And you will go through this cycle several times. What I want you to do is For those of you who've already come to grips with it, have a conversation with others who are still struggling with it. And especially when you become Rip Van Winkle and return to a brigade, you have to talk to the captains about this. Don't be ashamed of it. Talk to them about it. Let them know what they're experiencing because they are thinking this. And it's okay. You ought to help them think their way through it. Those two questions. What do I want? Where might I find it? Okay. Next thing. While you're here, you have the opportunity to get more deeply exposed to joint operations, combined operations, coalition operations, whole of government operations and activities. You get exposed to that while here. That's the name of the game. There's only one theater in the world where the United States military operates by service. Anyone know where that is? Washington, D.C. Everywhere else in the world, we fight and operate as a joint force. Okay? Only in D.C. for resourcing do services still have to go and stand on their own and compete with one another. I hate that, honestly. That's just my personal view that is not helping us. But out in the rest of the world, the joint force works together, and it does its work with multinational partners, some of whom are in coalition with us, where we've agreed to work together for a common purpose in a common area. Some of us are in a full combined relationship. And we've got some officers in here from the Republic of Korea, right? Where are you? All right, on the side over here is one. Okay, a few more. I met several last night. We have a standing combined headquarters in Korea. But there are other combined operations that occur out there where you're operating under alliance in a unified command. That's what you need to spend time with here because that's the world you're going to be going in when you get out. Get used to that. Have a conversation with your other service colleagues in here. How many Marines we got in here? Hoorah, okay. Any Air Force? All right. Navy? Space Force? All right, there's some space folks in here. That's good. Are there any Army in here? Okay, I was just checking. Get to know one another. Listen to how they view the world, what their limitations are, what their capabilities are. You're going to do some of that in the joint operations modules here that will be presented to you. But it's even better to get that firsthand conversation about what it's like to be an officer in one of those types of organizations and what they face, what they deal with. Any submarine officers in here? All right, there's one right down there. Any others? No, they're subsurface, so you can't see their hands until they raise the periscope. That was just one example of a completely different world of experience and one that's worth having a conversation about. I want you to think joint in all you do and have conversations about joint. Get to learn that. Final thing. One of the opportunities on the horizon as you come out of command in General Staff College is command opportunities. And the next command for most of you, if you have the privilege of commanding, is battalion level command. We've got a dynamic that's ongoing in the U.S. military and the U.S. Army specifically right now, where the best and brightest aren't all the ones who are knocking down the door to go into command. Some are, but not in the percentages that we would expect. I, as a retiree and a senior retiree, and those who are serving in senior leadership right now, this is a concern. And some of that could be how the burden of command looks to you and looks to your family. So I understand it. It's kind of another episode of professional puberty. We're trying to decide what's the right thing for me and for my family. But we need you to command. There's a process by which you're selected, and you know about that. Learn more about it, how to be successful at it. Most of it is just being yourself. But this process of command assessment program, in my view, is an improvement over past practices. It's imperfect, as all institutional systems are. But you should opt in. Don't opt out. This is really important. We need the best talent to lead our formations. Our soldiers deserve the best possible leadership. They should get nothing less than that. Not the best of the rest, the best of the best. which is what you are. So I want you to opt in. Now have conversations about that with one another and come to grips with the realities of what that might mean. Talk to folks on faculty who have been commanders before about what that really feels like. There's still some correlations. This is not exactly the same. You're under different circumstances than they are, but what I don't want to see and really want to discourage is a sense of self-protection that displaces a sense of duty. That's very dangerous. And that is not what militaries are built on. Militaries are built on a sense of duty and service above all things. And it is possible to try to create balance in life, and we can talk about that in the question and answers here in a minute if you want to. You have to find that balance for yourself. But the fulfillment of your role as a commissioned leader is to lead others and to develop others. You're selling your service short and yourself short if you opt out. I just want to encourage you on that. Okay, I've talked enough. I'm coming down. Who has the first question? Paddlemeister, guide me. Thank you very much.
Sir, thank you very much for your comments. As the moderator today, I get the honor of asking the first question.
All right.
Based on your experience, sir, in United States Forces Korea,
Yes.
Is denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula a valid goal to reach the end of deterrence in Indo-PACOM region?
Yes.
Is it? Thank you very much, sir.
All right, let me expand on that. Yes, it is. However, the reality of the world is you can't get the golden goose with one grab. All right, so you don't get to denuclearization just by saying that's our end and we're going straight to it. The sequencing of actions matters a lot, and culture matters a lot. So let me give you one example. What I learned as a commander there, and I commanded twice in Korea, once as a lieutenant colonel for 2 years, and then again as a four-star general. What I learned from that experience there is that culture counts on things like this. And I especially saw it as we reached a kind of a crescendo of danger in 2017, escalating pressure intentionally, but to try to cause a different set of decisions to be made by Kim Jong-un. And that succeeded. So he chose diplomacy as the route as opposed to military force. When we did that, we started having dialogue again with North Korea. It's amazing. They control the pace on dialogue, by the way. You can't compel them into dialogue. They decide when they're going to talk and when they're not. And they just started talking again. And it was actually productive and constructive, which surprised me, honestly. But there are two different approaches. I'm going to call this simplistically an Eastern approach and a Western approach. I'll start with the Western approach. The Western approach tends to correlate things like trust, denuclearization, and relationship in a certain sequence. So for the West, it is denuclearize, then I can change the relationship, and then I can trust you. The Eastern, and I'll label this as North Korea's perspective, view is exactly the opposite. It is, show me a new relationship, then I can trust you, then I will denuclearize, as I already told you I would. So North Korea has already said several times, two different leaders have said that they will not keep nuclear weapons. They got to have a completely different circumstance under which they would take that risk. So yes, it is achievable, but not in the first step. How do you change then the relationship? And can you take into account that their perspective might be the right one to work through with them? And that the alliance is actually stronger than they are? It doesn't outnumber them, but it is absolutely stronger. My personal view is that the pursuit of nuclear weapons on the South Korean side of the peninsula is not a good strategic move. There's a bit of face saving that's involved in that, and face is very important in that region. So I understand it. I understand where it's coming from. from a practical perspective, it creates escalation that is even more difficult to withdraw from, to retract, to remove. The chance of getting nuclear weapons out of both sides is more than twice as hard. And oh, by the way, it destabilizes the region. So I'm not in favor of that. But that to have that security established means to rely on the extended deterrence of the United States, which means the U.S. has to live up to its promises. It has to be believable, and it isn't always. Sometimes the U.S. is uncertain in how it projects to others, and it causes those countries to hedge their bets and protect their own interests. Got to understand that that's where they're coming from. So I get where this request for nuclear weapons is coming from in South Korea, but I don't find any strategic or tactical value in them. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
You shouldn't ask such a long question. All right, another one.
We've got one here on microphone 4.
Microphone 4.
Sir, Major Woodham, Staff Group 6 Alpha.
Okay.
My question is in relation to the current economics out of China, the slowdown in their housing, as well as their internal consumer base kind of not spending, and what that looks like in the future. If you think that would bode negatively for them to move up a timetable or increase the likelihood of conflict in that region. Thank you, sir.
In a short answer, no, I don't think it will. So this is again, an Eastern versus Western type of mindset. The Western mindset would be, we're running out of time, we got to hurry up. Got to get to the objective quickly, even if the risk is higher in doing so. I don't believe that's China's mindset. China is much more deliberate, much more patient. There is some impatience, to be sure, especially coming from Xi Jinping. All right, and how many more rounds will he do? He's already become almost leader for life. He's in his 3rd episode for something that traditionally doesn't last that long. What will be his legacy, and can he fulfill some of his key concerns? He has some personal impatience, but that is not matched by national impatience. The greater likelihood is that China seeks to avoid risks that lead to embarrassment or potential failure. And that becomes then a stratagem for those who seek to not have China move in a direction that can destabilize the world, economically or culturally. But rather that China operates within that world. Now, they've got their reasons for not wanting that geopolitical order. They didn't create it. And so they may not feel like they've got much stake in it, even though they benefited from it, certainly, as did many countries in the world. So we need to try to understand it from China's perspective. I don't believe they're going to rush into failure. I think they're far more likely to reset, recalculate, and look for the next best opportunity. And with haste, to bring that on as soon as possible, but through the least risky pathway. What can we do then? Cause them to never feel that comfort. So our actions need to cause doubt about outcomes. Because China will act when they have almost certainty in outcome. They will act. But if there can be doubt in the outcome from their eyes, it may change the timelines for the pursuit of that action. Circumstances may change. For example, the timeline that Xi Jinping put out, the 2037 timeline, for example, activated the U.S. and its allies. They didn't count on that. So it caused us to suddenly get excited, agitated. The dragon was stirred. And that changed the timelines for them. So as we now begin an acceleration of weapon system development, we've now changed doctrine, specifically oriented on that. We're thinking differently about it. China's in every conversation that happens now in our militaries. That wasn't what they were planning on. They were looking at a waning power and an ascendant power, and looking at that intercept point being a certain point in time in the future where they believed that they would ascend economically, militarily, socially, and maybe they're not, because the U.S. and ally curve went like that. It changed inflection. Never underestimate our flexibility. Might be late in coming sometimes, but it is a power that we have. Okay, please. I'm sorry, I turn back over to the moderator. You pick who it's going to be.
We'll go number
There's
2,
one
sir.
person standing there, so it's going to be easy.
Yes, sir.
All right, go ahead, please.
Sir, Captain Spencer Bates, Staff Group 10 Alpha. In your role as the USFK commander and with your experience in security cooperation in the Pacific, what do you see as military lines of effort to increase cooperation within the region in relation to coalition building and security cooperation?
Yeah, thanks. Certainly I engaged in that as the commander of U.S. Forces Korea, but I did more of that as the commander of U.S. Army Pacific and U.S. Army Central. So as a theater commander, I was much more involved in those types of engagement strategies. The Korean command is very localized. There was some reaching across to Japan especially, in that case, in my role as the United Nations commander. Since there are 7 bases in Japan that are United Nations Command bases intended to support anything that happens on the Korean Peninsula. So I had to have a relationship there. This is an important role for the military. This is not to displace in any way the Department of State, but rather to enable our diplomacy abroad. So there's a concept called military support to public diplomacy. Public diplomacy is that aspect of diplomacy that communicates what we're really all about, what we're focused on, what's important to us, our values, and the military plays a role in that. I used to describe it in simple terms as exporting professionalism. And that's what we do abroad. So when we send one of our units out on Operation Pathways or a Spartan Shield or something like that, I was involved in the creation of both of those. When we do that, when we project ourselves to somewhere else, we are bringing our professionalism with us. And the closer we are to whoever we are working with, one country, multiple countries, host nation, visiting nation, the closer we are, the more that professionalism rubs off. We don't have the market cornered on all military professionalism, but we have a lot. We have a lot to offer and a lot to learn, which makes us even better. That's what we do by projecting military forces out into these regions. That builds relationships, okay? That builds awareness of the region, how it really is, what it looks like from the eyes of others. That builds readiness, depending on what it is you're doing, readiness to operate in that region. Readiness to operate. It can create conditions for a coalition. It can help other countries rise to their goals. I'll tell a short story about visiting Vietnam. So I wanted to see Vietnam. My father had been over there twice. I wanted to see where was this place that took my father away from me twice. You know, the first one was easier than the second one. As a military kid, the second deployment was harder for me, even though I was older and had been through it once before. It may have been for your kids too, for those of you who have been deployed. I wanted to see this place. And I also knew that we had some strategic opportunities in Vietnam. Anyone here from Vietnam? Okay. The strategic opportunities were many. Vietnam had just celebrated 20 years of normal diplomatic relations with the United States. And I was coming in at that time in the 20th year. They wanted to share that knowledge with other countries like North Korea and Cuba, who had been seeking out Vietnam's experience on how do you get a normal relationship with the United States when you've been an adversary. They also wanted to engage in international peacekeeping operations. And our friends from Malaysia and Indonesia are involved in that. Philippines, do we have anyone from the Philippines here? Okay. Our friends in the region were already involved in international disaster response operations and peacekeeping operations. And Vietnam wanted to begin to participate in that, but they only wanted to limit how they would do that with medical units. And so we visited Vietnam. They wanted us to come to Da Nang. Literally, we were sitting in a room, got a narrow space between the two sides, traditional structure, and the senior most are at one end, the junior most are at the opposite end, their side, our side, no table between us, but sitting in chairs, everyone facing inward. And we were coming to the end of the meeting, and I was going to ask them about the possibility of us coming with a presence in Da Nang on a repetitive basis. That's something that the Department of State had indicated, Department of Defense indicated. might be a desirable outcome. And literally, I see this note being passed from the second most senior person down to the most junior Vietnamese person. Then it crosses the room down at the bottom while we're talking. And the note then follows its way from my most junior person up to me. And the note says, "Ask about Da Nang." Remember where that note started. So our presence makes it possible for the current order to be adjusted. And we now have visits that happen in Da Nang. Any of our sailors visited Da Nang yet? Okay, there's one up in the back who has. We talked to them about putting a U.S. Army hospital set, a combat support hospital set that we had in Japan, wanted to move it onto the Asian continent in Vietnam and allow them to train on it to prepare their humanitarian assistance, disaster response, and peacekeeping capability, which they wanted to be a military hospital. And oh, by the way, that hospital is in the Asian continent. There are things like that that we do in military organizations that create relationships, create possible conditions for coalition, can create coalition. The Australia, US, UK relationship, AUKUS, the Quad, all these things are derivative from military activities that have been ongoing for a while. And it's softened the environment at policy levels in countries and then made it possible for the deals to be closed at diplomatic and national levels. Military enables a lot of things like that, and it's important work. Mr. Moderator, back to you, sir.
Number 4.
Good morning, sir. Major Austin Abernathy, 11 Alpha. Sir, I know that here we've really experienced the desire for us to have professional dialogue and exchanging professional thought. So since we're already swamped with so much reading, my question is not where are you reading or what are you reading, but my question is where are you going to get that exchange of professional thought, and also where are you contributing to that professional thought? So either like a podcast or what are you writing? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, it's good to keep the brain cells working. I find my ability to get concentrated reading right now is more distracted than I expected it to be. My reading tends to be online a lot, and I tend to go from subject to subject. I do have books that have been given to me, some books that I was able to participate in. I just had 2 books delivered just yesterday. So I've got a stack of things I need to read. I just can't seem to get the time and the discipline to read them. All right, so that's on me. I know better as a SAMS graduate. I know I got the SAMS director right here within choke range. That's right. So I learned how to read here at Leavenworth. I mean, really to read and get something out of it in a rapid fashion, just like you are and are going to. But how do you stay engaged in it? So one of the things that you may have heard in the introduction, I participate in some thought leadership. This is one example of it, giving back, exchanging ideas, sharing what I learned, hearing what you're experiencing. The dialogue is part of that. I do that with 3 academic institutions right now where I'm a fellow or chair. So at Harvard University Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, I'm a fellow, and I go up and exchange with them from time to time, a couple times a year. University of Texas, Clement Center for National Security, and the Strauss Center for International Security and Law. I'm a fellow, dual credentialed to those 2 centers at the University of Texas. Same thing, I'll participate in roundtables or such topic discussions, bringing in perspective. I actually do this in my corporate boards. I try to bring an international understanding into the corporate boardroom, an understanding of risk, or at least an appreciation of risk on a more macro scale. And that keeps me fresh to hear perspectives of others as we're doing that. I've written a few things here recently, a lot of forewords that I've done. I've done 4 forewords in the last 2 years for different books that are being published, and have co-published some things with some people. I've participated in several think tank papers, white papers that come out and become policy documents with several different leading think tanks, like the Center for Strategic International Studies, Council on Foreign Relations. And so I've written for some of those to share some ideas and add to the body of thought out there and stimulate discussion. That's what keeps me intellectually engaged. Giving back to the generations behind me gives me the greatest thrill, honestly. I'm enjoying this a lot more than you are. I feel energy from you, and I just enjoy passing knowledge so that you don't have to walk the path alone. It may be a little bit overgrown, but you don't have to walk it alone. You don't have to walk it for the first time. Go ahead, moderator, please.
Hey, good morning, sir. Major Will Carpenter, Group 8 Bravo. So my question is about, over the past 75 years, our defense industrial base has been a cornerstone of our national power. But as weapon systems have become increasingly complex, expensive, and the number of prime contractors has dwindled, we're starting to see that base shrink significantly. And so ours is decreasing, whereas we see China's is increasing. So how do we reverse course on this problem, sir? Thanks.
I can tell you, it will not be done overnight. And if it is, it means about a 35 to 45% spending of GDP. And we have no tolerance for that right now. So the United States is one of the largest spenders on GDP in raw monetary value. It's the largest, but it's at 3.5%. 3.5%. So 3.5 pennies in the change tray when you pay $1. It's a really small amount. We're a global power on the cheap. It's my personal view. Now, should it be bigger than that? That's a political decision. That's about the tolerance of the body politic and politicians to request more. We have big amounts of money in the Department of Defense. The largest piece of the discretionary budget that faces the Congress is in defense, and yet we don't have enough money. How is that even possible? Where are our colleagues from the State Department here? Any? Okay, so State's going, how can you ever complain about not having enough resources? Look at this room. You think Department of State can fill a room with 560 people for professional development? No, they're out there doing their mission. So things that we have, we take for granted, to be sure. And it's a difficult argument. However, the question was about the industrial base. The industrial base is sharp in some things, but has mostly atrophied. So I would beg to differ about the past 75 years. Maybe 75 years ago, I'd agree with that. But that was a 35% spending of GDP in the 1940s, really from 1943 to 1947. Over 30%. That's a much more significant commitment than what we're going to see in the era of competition. So competition is going to be done from an impoverished condition, not a rich condition. And I'm talking about rich in terms of flowing the wealth of the nation into that. We don't mobilize our citizenry. We don't mobilize our industry. And we haven't reached the circumstance that has really called for that. There have been some things that have been localized, like the concentration to produce mine-resistant armor-protected vehicles. That was an industry concentration. The surging to produce pharmaceuticals to turn COVID back around. That was an actual industrial mobilization. And we are agile to do that. Industry has to have a reason to do that. One of the boards that I'm on has some interactions with the Department of Defense and with the U.S. government. And I can tell you it's not lucrative for them. So doing it out of patriotism is only good until your company collapses. Your shareholders say, get out of that government business. That's why so few are now in it. So there's only certain primes who are in it because that's what they live with. They're accustomed to the profit rates that there are. And yes, it is for profit. These are businesses. The alternative is to pull all of that into the defense industrial base within the Department of Defense. Depots, factories, production centers, and that's very, very costly. Very costly. So right now it's not economically feasible. So what do you do if you're finding yourself sliding down that spectrum toward conflict? Well, again, you failed. But that would require a very different set of national decisions, and it would probably come late. So the drift from competition into crisis is about as far as our nations want to go. And they can do that with some specific enhancements, like a fund that is created to cash flow operations in Iraq or Afghanistan, or in the Pacific or in Europe. We can cash flow that for a period of time. But eventually that expires. People say, I'm tired. We're paying too much. Inflation is happening at home. I can't get the job I want because you're driving everything into the government. And we may stop. Is that a strategic vulnerability? Yes, it is. Particularly in that part of the spectrum from crisis to conflict. It is at risk. I've had conversations with Army Futures Command and with the Joint Staff J7, part of this question about giving back, and shared with that about the future warfighting concepts. They don't talk about that. They don't talk about mobilization, national level mobilization of resources, of industry, and of humankind. And without those levels of mobilization, a global crisis, a global competition that falls into crisis and then conflict at some regional area may not be able to be sustained. If it goes from regional to global war, you don't have a choice. We'll have to make different decisions. So do you have enough to be able to push it back in the opposite direction? That's the strategic calculus that national decision makers will actually undertake. Do we have enough as it is, and can we do it more efficiently so that the rate of burn of the funds that we do have is done differently? So you'll be driven into efficiency on things, and you'll be frustrated by that as a major out there in the unit. Why is someone telling me to be efficient when I need to be effective? Don't they know the difference? And they do, but they're wrestling with something very different than you are. Okay? And you got to keep pushing against it and say that I can't be effective at this level of efficiency. It's efficient to have one set of equipment and have multiple units rotate through on it. That's efficient. It's not very effective because you have to have an equipment set to train on. You need at least two. That's just an example. So efficiency and effectiveness are in competition with one another. But our approaches, and this is for all of our nations, are going to be to keep the least amount of cost so you have the least amount of effect on your citizenry while you're defending them. Okay? That's just the reality that's out there. Strategic risk, to be sure. That's why you have to not let it get into conflict. Okay.
And with the last question?
The last question.
Cavalry, sir, Staff Group 14 Alpha. You mentioned the need to maintain flexibility to perpetuate options. How do you feel we are maintaining that Indo-Pacific based off recent headlines that we no longer have a carrier in the region for the first time in decades?
Well, carrier presence is a temporary circumstance. Now, there's a calculation of how many carriers in a given 6-month or 1-year period you have, and terms like a 1.0 presence when you have one carrier strike group in a given combatant command area of responsibility, or 2.0. But when you have a crisis, which we have ongoing now in the Middle East, because of the limitation of resources, you have to surge it to cause a change in the calculations that are occurring. The calculation of force availability, the calculations mentally of adversaries so that they become deterred or compelled into a certain behavior. And that's temporary. So the 2 carrier strike groups that have been pushed to the Middle East right now, they won't stay there. So for a period of time, I had 3 in the Korean area, Western Pacific, near Korea, Japan, focused on Korea to send a message. And it was great. I love that. The combatant command is out there going, whoa, what happened to my carriers? And the answer was, one of them that was already in the region on a 1.0 presence was joined by one coming out of the Indian Ocean, completing its Middle East tour on the way back home to its home port. It was delayed in returning home. The one to replace it was not allowed to transit Malacca into the Indian Ocean and into the Arabian Gulf, and it was kept also. So we had 3 by changing schedule. Now that has an impact on the ship's company, without a doubt. People feel that. They're gone for a longer period of time than they expected. Such is the nature of military operations, but that's what happens. So the 2 that are in there right now is not because we had an extra one in our pocket. We had to move it from somewhere else where it's on an operational mission, probably from European Command into now Central Command, in addition to the 1.0 that was already in the Arabian Gulf area and the northern Indian Ocean. That's how it's actually managed. Guess what? There's majors and lieutenant colonels who do that. You're going to do that. So how can we create a temporary 3.0 presence in this combatant command AOR? And the answer is by doing that kind of shifting of schedule. What's the downstream effect of that? So when you delay a maintenance schedule, you extend the maintenance when it's done, which means you will have fewer. You might have a 1.5 presence instead of a 2.0 presence because half the year was spent in maintenance that was not projected on the timeline. There's an impact to every decision. And as staff officers, you have to think your way through the full longitude of a problem and elevate the risk. So, Commander, we can do this by making these adjustments right here, but the consequence is going to be to the Navy and to the budget. We had unforecasted maintenance, so it's forecasted for this fiscal year, but it now is going to be in next fiscal year, and the contractors that do it have to get paid between now and then. So you're going to pay twice, once for the scheduled maintenance and one for the maintenance that didn't happen. These are the consequences. Now, it comes from having not enough assets. So how do we do that in Indo-Pacific? It's that same way. The Indo-Pacific commander puts a demand signal on, lots of demand signals. The other combatant commands go, wait a minute, not so fast. Don't take my joint direct attack munitions for something that might happen when I'm in the middle of a fight. There's always tension between EUCOM, CENTCOM, and PACOM especially. PACOM is the priority theater, but doesn't have all the assets because the assets are in use. We had that with drone lines for a few years ago when I was there. I was trying to get more drones to come to Korea, so I couldn't see. I needed to have the ability to strike if we had to very quickly to change the calculation, which means I needed those joint direct attack munitions, those JDAMs. I needed to have more loads for air defense systems because I had active missile sets that were ongoing in front of me. That had to come from somewhere. The industrial base is not going to produce it overnight. They're not going to hire lines of workers to do that. These are the realities you're going to face. It's done by craftiness, cunning, and by signaling that I have two here now, but I can bring more. I can surge. That's the one thing about the U.S. forces. Because we have a combatant command structure that covers the globe, and we have a joint staff that allocates resources, we can move things from one theater to the next and concentrate where we need to change the calculation. It may take some days to do that, steaming days. It may take hours, depending on what the circumstance is and where it's coming from. All right? So that's important. The ability to surge is actually one of our powers within the military element of power. Hey, thank you all very much for your time and your attention. I wish you a great year. Make it count. And everything that follows thereafter, I wish you the best of success. We're counting on you. My generation is out of the way. We're going to keep throwing ideas at you. Go Bees. But you're going to be the ones who actually turn it into reality in the world as it is right now. So understand it better, operate better, be better than we were. You have to do that. You can't do anything less. And you can do that just by being who you are. The professionals you are will make you better than I was and my contemporaries were. We're counting on you. God bless all of you. Thanks very much.
At this time, Major General retired Chris P. Hughes, CGSC Foundation Chairman, along with Colonel Dave Norris, the CGSS Director, are presenting General Brooks with a coin to commemorate his service as the guest speaker for the academic year 2025 Colin L. Powell Lecture Series.
Go ahead. Sir, on behalf of Army University and the Command General Staff School, I just want to take this opportunity to publicly thank you in front of all these great officers for your contribution this morning. Sharing that perspective and offering these insights and the sage wisdom that comes with it. We can't tell you how much we appreciate you being here and how much we appreciate your contribution. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Colonel Norris. Appreciate it. Thanks very much. Thank you all.
Sir, on behalf of the CGSC Foundation, we appreciate you coming out. They have no idea how important what you just gave them is going to be the rest of this year and when they leave here. So, again, you're a great role model, great mentor, and I appreciate your time, sir.
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
Great seeing you again.
Talk tomorrow.
Thank you all.